Germany, 1933. The shelves in the shops are thinning. The factories that once roared with production stand mostly silent. 6 million people are unemployed, 30% of the entire workforce. Families are selling off furniture on street corners just to put food on the table. The currency had already been destroyed once, just a decade before, when it took wheelbarrows full of paper notes to buy a single loaf of bread. Banks had collapsed. Savings had been wiped out. Pensions had become worthless overnight. 2 economic catastrophes in 14 years had broken the German middle class in ways that would take generations to repair. And then Adolf Hitler walks into power in January 1933.
Und muss sagen, den Frieden wollen wir!
Inheriting what is essentially a nation on its knees, with empty coffers, a crippled economy, and an international treaty designed to make sure it could never build a serious military again. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was restricted to 100,000 soldiers. No tanks, no aircraft, no submarines, no heavy artillery. The victors of the First World War had drawn the lines clearly. Germany would stay disarmed and manageable. Yet just 6 years later, in September 1939, Germany tears across the Polish border with 3 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 4,000 aircraft, fielding the most modern and devastating war machine Europe had ever seen. In 6 years, starting from nothing, with a bankrupt government, a crushed economy, and a treaty forbidding rearmament, the Nazi regime had built the most powerful military on the continent. So how exactly did they pay for it? How did a government with no money, no credit, and no legal right to rearm manage to pull off the largest military buildup in modern history without the world noticing until it was far too late? The answer reaches into the heart of a financial scheme so brazen it almost defies belief. A ghost company buried inside Germany's banking system, invisible debts running into the billions, and a scam that required constant conquest just to avoid collapsing under its own weight. And behind all of it, one man. A financial genius who built the machine, watched it spin out of control, tried to stop it, and was promptly thrown out the door. This is how Hitler funded a huge military when Germany was broke. To really grasp the scale of what happened, it helps to understand just how complete the destruction was before Hitler ever arrived. The hyperinflation of 1923 is almost impossible to describe without it sounding like fiction. At its peak, a single American dollar was worth 4 trillion German marks. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day, because by evening, the wages from that morning had already become nearly worthless. Restaurants changed their prices mid-meal, with waiters climbing onto chairs to call out new numbers every half hour. Life insurance policies that German families had faithfully paid into for decades matured into sums that could not even cover a postage stamp. An entire generation of savers, professionals, pensioners, teachers, engineers saw everything they had built evaporate in a matter of months. Germany eventually stabilized. The currency was reformed. Life slowly crept back toward something resembling normality. And then 1929 arrived. American banks began calling in their loans. German businesses folded. The unemployment numbers climbed month after month until by 1932, nearly a third of all German workers had no job at all. The Weimar government was paralyzed, unable to agree on solutions, while communist and Nazi factions fought running street battles in the cities. Political violence had become routine. Faith in democratic institutions had collapsed entirely. This is the environment that made Hitler possible. This is the broken country that handed him power. So the promise was enormous: restore Germany's greatness, defy Versailles, rebuild a military that would make the nation feared again. The crowds responded with the kind of desperate enthusiasm that only comes from people who have lost almost everything. But promises do not pay arms manufacturers. Speeches do not build aircraft. And Germany's treasury, by any honest accounting, was empty. Rearming on the scale Hitler envisioned should have been impossible. He needed a way to spend money the government did not have in secret, without triggering the inflation that had destroyed Germany once before, and without foreign powers seeing what was happening until it was too late to stop it. That is where Hjalmar Schacht enters the story. Born in 1877, Schacht had already established himself as one of the most gifted financial minds in Europe. He had actually saved Germany once before. During the chaos of the 1923 hyperinflation, it was Schacht who designed and implemented the new currency that brought the economy back from the edge. He created the Rentenmark, backed not by gold, but by German land itself, and almost overnight, the spiral stopped. The man who had rescued Germany from economic apocalypse once was now being handed the keys again. Hitler appointed him president of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, in March 1933. By August 1934, Schacht had also been made Minister of Economics. His assignment was as simple to state as it was impossible by normal means to achieve. Fund the fastest military buildup in history without anyone outside Germany knowing the full extent of it. The challenge was very specific. Rearmament required paying enormous sums to steel manufacturers, aviation companies, chemical plants, and arms producers. But if the government simply printed money to cover those payments, two things would happen almost immediately. Inflation would return, and given what Germans had lived through in 1923, that would be politically catastrophic. And the spending would appear on official Reichsbank records, visible to foreign governments, who would know immediately that Germany was rearming on a massive scale and might intervene before the military was ready to defend itself. What Hitler needed was money that was invisible, money that bypassed official ledgers, money that did not technically exist, yet somehow built tanks and aircraft and warships. Schacht created it. In 1934, a new company was quietly registered. Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, meaning Metallurgical Research Company, Limited Liability. Mefo for short. On paper, it was a research consortium jointly owned by four major German industrial firms: Siemens, Krupp, Rheinmetall, and Gute Hoffnungshütte. Its nominal capitalization was 1,000,000 Reichsmarks. It had an address, letterhead, and a bank account. In reality, it produced nothing. It researched nothing. It was a shell, a legal fiction designed with one purpose, and one purpose only. Here is how the scheme worked in practice. The government contracts with an arms manufacturer for hundreds of tanks, thousands of aircraft components, mountains of artillery shells. Instead of paying with Reichsmarks from the official treasury, the government hands over Mefo bills. These are promissory notes, formal I owe us, issued by the shell company, promising to pay the holder the full amount within 5 years. The arms manufacturer does not want to wait 5 years to fund its operations. It needs cash now to pay its own workers and buy raw materials. So it takes the Mefo bills to a private commercial bank. The private bank knows that the Reichsbank stands behind Mefo, that these pieces of paper carry the implicit guarantee of the central bank. The bank exchanges the bills for real Reichsmarks, perhaps at a modest discount. The manufacturer has its cash, and the private bank now holds a portfolio of Mefo bills. When the private bank later presents those bills to the Reichsbank, the central bank converts them using its money-creating powers. But here is the critical sleight of hand. None of this appears on the official Reichsbank balance sheet as government debt. Mefo bills are formally the obligations of a private company. They are not government bonds. They are not sovereign debt. Officially, They are the liabilities of a small metallurgical research firm that nobody outside Germany had ever heard of. Foreign governments and financial analysts studying German accounts saw nothing alarming because there was nothing alarming to see. Between 1934 and 1938, Germany issued 12 billion Reichsmarks in Mefo bills. To put that in context, Germany's entire national debt in 1932 stood at roughly 10 billion Reichsmarks. In 4 years, the Nazi regime had secretly accumulated hidden obligations exceeding the country's total official debt, and had used that invisible money to build tanks, warplanes, ships, and artillery on a scale the world would not fully comprehend until German forces were already marching. By 1936, Germany had violated virtually every military restriction imposed by Versailles. The Allies, looking at official figures, still did not grasp the scale of what had happened. They had been watching the official ledger while the real story was being written somewhere else entirely. But debt, even hidden debt, does not disappear. It waits. Those Mefo bills carried a 5-year maturity. The first ones issued in 1934 would come due in 1939. And in 1939, Germany did not have 12 billion Reichsmarks in hand to honor them. This is where the comparison to a Ponzi scheme stops being a metaphor and starts being a diagnosis. A Ponzi scheme functions on the same basic mechanics as any legitimate investment operation, right up until the moment it does not. Early participants receive their promised returns, paid not from genuine profits, but from money brought in by new participants. The scheme appears to work. It requires only a constant supply of new money flowing in. The moment that flow slows, the entire structure becomes insolvent overnight. There is no underlying value. There is no sustainable engine. There is only the momentum of the scheme itself. Nazi Germany's economic machinery worked the same way. Mefo bills were promises to pay in the future, based on an assumption that the German economy would grow fast enough to cover the obligations. By 1938, it was obvious the economy could not generate the revenue needed. The scheme needed a new source of funding, and there was only one place to get it, at the speed and scale required. Conquest. When Germany absorbed Austria in 1938, it seized the Austrian national gold reserves and foreign exchange holdings outright. When German forces occupied Czechoslovakia, they absorbed one of Europe's most modern armaments industries entirely intact, along with its national bank assets. Resources that would take years to build from scratch were simply taken. When Poland fell in 1939, it brought agricultural output, raw materials, infrastructure, and a massive forced labor supply. The pattern was not incidental, it was structural. The Nazi economy had been engineered in a way that made territorial expansion a financial requirement, not merely an ideological ambition. Schacht saw this trajectory clearly, and it terrified him. As early as 1937, he was raising alarms inside government, warning Hitler that the economy was overheating, that the spending could not continue at its current pace without triggering the inflation that the entire scheme had been designed to avoid, that the bills coming due in 1939 could not be met through any domestic mechanism. In January 1939, with the first Mefo bills just weeks from maturity, Schacht led the Reichsbank board in submitting a formal report urging immediate and drastic reductions in military spending, a balanced budget, and a return to financial discipline as the only path away from economic catastrophe. Hitler's response came back on January 20th. Schacht was dismissed as Reichsbank president. The man who had constructed the machine was removed for having the nerve to explain why it was about to break down. And the machine kept running, because the alternative was to let it stop. Mefo bills were only one layer of how the regime sustained itself. The broader economic model had other pillars, and they were darker in every dimension. When Germany conquered a country, systematic plunder followed as a matter of official policy. France was subjected to occupation costs amounting to 400 million francs per day. Not occupation costs as a nominal formality, but as a genuine transfer of French national wealth into German war coffers. France was made to fund its own occupation, month after month, while German military spending continued at full throttle. In the Soviet Union, the economic planning documents prepared before the invasion laid out in explicit detail how Ukrainian grain, Caucasian oil, and Russian raw materials would be extracted to sustain the German economy at home. The war in the East was conceived partly as an economic rescue operation. Then there is forced labor. Concentration camp prisoners were leased to German industrial firms, working in weapons factories, chemical plants, and coal mines across occupied Europe. Companies of significant industrial prominence used this labor supply as an integral part of their production capacity. Workers were expendable and were treated accordingly. When they could no longer work, they were replaced. This was not a side effect of the Nazi regime. It was a load-bearing element of its economic model. The structure of genocide and the structure of the German war economy were not separate things. They were the same thing. There was theft of another kind as well, one that showed how the regime was willing to steal even from its own people. Germans were invited to participate in a savings scheme to purchase a Volkswagen, the people's car. The promise was straightforward. Pay a small amount each month into a savings account administered through the German labor front, and eventually receive a car. Across the country, ordinary Germans participated dutifully, accumulating payments that totaled 275 million Reichsmarks. The number of civilian Volkswagens actually delivered to German savers during the entire Third Reich was 0. The factory had been redirected to military production before a single civilian vehicle rolled off the line. The savings were absorbed by the regime and never returned. Compensation for those defrauded savers did not come until the 1960s, 2 decades after the regime that had taken their money had been reduced to rubble. Jewish property followed a similar logic on an immeasurably larger scale. Businesses, bank accounts, homes, artworks, personal savings, accumulated across generations, all of it confiscated through a cascading series of laws and directives, sold off or absorbed directly into state finances. This was not persecution that happened to have an economic dimension. The economic extraction was an explicit design feature from the beginning, a way of seizing significant private wealth and converting it into state revenue to fund an apparatus the German government could not otherwise afford. And there was one more layer of financial cynicism worth understanding. During the Weimar years, Germany had borrowed heavily from Britain, France, and the United States, largely to meet the reparations payments imposed by Versailles. Germany accepted those loans. Then, in 1933, Hitler unilaterally stopped paying reparations, keeping the borrowed money. That left Germany in possession of funds lent by nations it would eventually invade, having used the money of future enemies to build the military that would be pointed at them. By the time 1939 arrived, the Nazi economic model had become visibly unsustainable, even to those inside it. Inflation pressures were building. Shortages of consumer goods were growing more difficult to conceal. The Mefo bills were maturing. The warnings Schacht had given were being proven correct in real time. But the regime could not simply stop. Stopping meant admitting the liabilities. Stopping meant that the bills would come due with nothing behind them. Stopping meant unemployment returning, confidence collapsing, the political crisis that the entire edifice had been constructed to prevent. The only mechanism available to keep the scheme from unraveling was to continue feeding it. This is the aspect of Nazi Germany that historians still find worth dwelling on, not merely because it is intellectually interesting, but because it reframes the entire question of why the war happened. Hitler's aggression has often been explained primarily through ideology, the racial worldview, the living space doctrine, the resentments of a generation that felt Germany had been stabbed in the back and cheated. All of that is real. None of it should be minimized. But layered beneath the ideology was a financial architecture that had made war not a choice, but a necessity. By 1939, the German economy had two available futures: expand or collapse. The regime chose to expand because a government that presided over economic collapse after everything it had promised would not survive the political consequences. Historian Adam Tooze laid this out with precision in his analysis of the Nazi economy. The entire system was built on borrowed time from the moment the first Mefo bill was signed. It was not a sustainable economy redirected toward war. It was an inherently war-dependent economy, disguised as a recovery. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, one of the most consequential military gambles in history, cannot be explained entirely through ideology. The oil fields of the Caucasus, the grain fields of Ukraine, the industrial resources of the Western Soviet Union, all of it was being counted as the raw material that would finally provide the economic base the German system had been pretending to have for years. When Germany's military fortunes reversed in 1943 and territories began to be lost rather than gained, the economic model had no answer. Plunder requires conquest. Forced labor requires territory to draw it from. When the expansion stopped, the parasitic economy had nothing left to consume. The pyramid collapsed because there were no more levels to add. So consider what this actually means about how Hitler paid for the war. The honest answer is that he did not, at least not in any sustainable sense. The rearmament was funded through hidden debt that was never intended to be honored by legitimate means. The war was funded through systematic theft from conquered populations. The production was sustained through the forced labor of people treated as disposable. The entire enterprise was a scheme that required constant new victims to avoid meeting the consequences of its own design. Schacht had built an instrument of extraordinary ingenuity and handed it to a regime that had no understanding of limits and no interest in the warnings of the man who built it. He was gone before the bills came due. The bills came due anyway, and the response to that reckoning was 6 years of war that killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. The next time anyone asks how a bankrupt country built the most powerful military in the world in 6 years, the answer worth sitting with is not admirable financial creativity. It is an enormous scam, built on invisible debt, sustained by conquest, and paid for ultimately by the populations it consumed. And when the conquest stopped, there was nothing behind it. There never had been. What do you think about the economic forces driving the war? Could the Nazi regime have ever transitioned to a sustainable peacetime economy? Or was conflict always the only thing keeping the whole structure standing? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this changed the way you think about what really set World War II in motion, make sure to subscribe for more history that goes beneath the surface of what you thought you already knew.